Welcome to Devotionary, where we make the Bible accessible and applicable. In our day and age, sin has become little more than an afterthought. We have so minimized the significance of sin that we prefer to use terms like mistake. And we seem to think there's no need to confess our mistakes because, in the grand scheme of things, they're just not that important. We've come to believe that God forgives and forgets. After all, He's a loving and gracious God. But in Isaiah chapter 9, verse 18, through chapter 10, verse 4, we see a starkly different picture of God's outlook on mankind's sin. He doesn't view it as some kind of an oversight or innocent mistake. No, God sees our sins as transgressions against His holiness. He views us as rebels, who stand in stubborn opposition to His divine decrees. He doesn't excuse our sinfulness or take it lightly. His holiness will not allow Him to do so. He must punish sin. He must deal justly and righteously with rebellious men and women. Why? Because He knows that sin, if left unaccounted for, will spread like a cancer. It is deadly, and man is incapable of dealing with its devastating influence on his own. Mankind has a natural proclivity to rationalize the presence of sin. We either deny it exists or downplay its impact. And in doing so, we ignore the inherent danger of its existence. Sin is nothing short of rebellion against God's will concerning man's relationship with Him, but also with one another. When God gave His commandments, they had a vertical and horizontal aspect to them. They were intended to regulate man's relationship with God, but also with the rest of creation, especially other men who had been made in God's image. God was not just interested in men showing Him honor and extending to Him the glory He deserved. He wanted them to treat one another with justice, and He wanted us to keep all His commandments, not just those that covered our relationship with Him. And by this we know that we have come to know Him, if we keep His commandments. Whoever says, "I know Him," but does not keep His commandments is a liar, and the truth is not in him. 1 John 2, verses 3 through 4. And John went on to clarify that keeping the commandments of God included all those commands that had to do with our relationships with our fellow men. Whoever says he is in the light and hates his brother is still in darkness. Whoever loves his brother abides in the light, and in him there is no cause for stumbling. But whoever hates his brother is in the darkness and walks in the darkness, and does not know where he is going, because the darkness has blinded his eyes. 1 John 2, verses 9 through 11. And Isaiah warned the peoples of Judah and Israel that their failure to keep the commands of God were going to bring the judgment of God. Their refusal to treat God as holy and to treat their brothers and sisters with dignity was going to result in devastation. The land will be blackened by the fury of the Lord of heaven's armies. The people will be fuel for the fire, and no one will spare even his own brother. Isaiah 9, verse 19. The people were going to find themselves turning on one another in a vain attempt to survive the judgment God would unleash on them. But this would simply be a more intense manifestation of their normal treatment of one another. Because of their disregard for God and their disrespect for one another, God would allow them to literally devour one another. They will attack their neighbor on the right, but will still be hungry. They will devour their neighbor on the left, but will not be satisfied. In the end, they will even eat their own children. Isaiah 9, verse 20. When the Assyrians attacked, it would become every man for himself. Manasseh will feed on Ephraim, Ephraim will feed on Manasseh, and both will devour Judah. Isaiah 9, verse 21. Tribes would turn against their fellow tribes. Brothers would abuse brothers, all because they had failed to love God and love one another. The peoples of Judah and Israel had a track record of abuse, and Isaiah leveled some stinging indictments against them. What sorrow awaits the unjust judges and those who issue unfair laws. They deprive the poor of justice and deny the rights of the needy among my people. They prey on widows and take advantage of orphans. Isaiah 10, verses 1 through 2. From the top down, they were all guilty of practicing injustices of all kinds. They took advantage of the weak and defenseless. They failed to care for the helpless and hopeless, and in doing so, they were violating the expressed will of God. He has told you, O man, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you but to do justice and to love kindness and to walk humbly with your God? Micah 6, verse 8. To do righteousness and justice is more acceptable to the Lord than sacrifice. Proverbs 21, verse 3. Righteousness, justice, kindness, mercy. These things were missing among the people of God. Because they had forsaken God, they no longer had a heart for God, and their own hearts failed to reflect the character of God. They had turned away from Him and were now turning on one another. And their unjust and unrighteous behavior was going to bring down on them God's righteous wrath in the form of the Assyrian army. What will you do when I punish you, when I send disaster upon you from a distant land? To whom will you turn for help? Where will your treasures be safe? Isaiah 10, verse 3. Israel had determined to put all their hope in their alliance with the Syrians, but they would prove to be no help when the Assyrians showed up. The nation of Judah had placed their faith in their alliance with the Assyrians, but they would soon discover that the fall of their northern neighbor at the hands of their ally would be far from good news. They would also suffer because of their failure to trust God. They too would endure the judgment of God because of their refusal to live in obedience to God. But as bad as it would get, the end of God's righteous wrath would not yet be exhausted. You will stumble along as prisoners or lie among the dead, but even then the Lord's anger will not be satisfied. His fist is still poised to strike. Isaiah 10, verse 4. This should give us some idea of just how much God hates sin. He doesn't overlook it or excuse it. He doesn't make light of it. In fact, Isaiah describes the devastating nature of sin in very stark terms. This wickedness is like a brush fire. It burns not only briars and thorns, but also sets the forests ablaze. Its burning sends up clouds of smoke. Isaiah 9, verse 18. Sin is deadly. It may start small, but it spreads quickly and leaves a path of devastation in its wake. Like an out-of-control wildfire, it destroys everyone and everything in its path, which is why God is obligated to deal with it in such a dramatic fashion. We may excuse it, rationalize it, minimize or deny it, but God cannot and will not.